My ex humiliated me at work and then wanted a ride to my new city. Oh, now you need my help? I met Sarah in mid-2022 at the company we both worked. I was 34 and she was 29, though the age gap never really felt like a big deal. There was a certain ease in how we connected right from the start, a kind of spark that made it effortless for us to talk about almost anything. I still remember the first time I actually noticed her. She had a contagious laugh that transformed her entire face and drew other people in. I had overheard her laughter from across the office, and something in it made me look up. When our eyes finally met, I thought it was one of those cliched moments people talk about, like time slowing down just enough for you to realize something special is unfolding. We worked on some overlapping projects, though not always in the same department. I was known as the guy who double-checked everyone's spreadsheets and did a lot of the behind-the-scenes work, while she had a reputation for great communication skills and a knack for building client relationships. Early on, we found reasons to pass by each other's desks, mostly exchanging small talk and quick jokes. The more we chatted, the more I found myself making excuses to stop by wherever she was, even for something as trivial as borrowing a stapler or asking if she wanted coffee. I could sense her doing the same. It all felt new and exciting, but there was a kind of warmth to it too. Like maybe this was how things were supposed to start when they went well. We began spending time together outside the office, first in small group settings, then eventually alone. The first time she and I had dinner by ourselves, we went to this little Italian restaurant near work that served some of the best homemade pasta I'd ever had. I remember the flickering candle on the table casting gentle shadows across her face. We were still in that phase where every question opened up a world of conversation. Childhood memories, favorite books, the music that made us cry. She told me how she'd learned to paint when she was a teenager, and that she'd always dreamed of being an artist in a sunny studio somewhere in the mountains. It was the kind of intimate, free-flowing conversation that made me feel like we could spend hours just discovering each other's worlds. Not long after we started dating officially, I felt a rush of excitement, like life had taken a sudden, wonderful turn. Of course, relationships are rarely just smooth rides, but when things are at that early stage, when everything about the other person is thrilling, you tend to gloss over small red flags or the possibility of any big issues. The first sign that things might not be as perfect as they seemed came a couple of weeks into our relationship, but I shrugged it off because it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. It was something small and silly, some disagreement about weekend plans, and I thought we'd iron it out as we got to know each other better. Then, maybe a month or so in, something unexpected and painful happened. Sarah suddenly ended things with me. It wasn't just a private conversation either. She made the breakup a public affair, right in the middle of the office, with raised voices that caught the attention of nearly everyone. I was blindsided, and to this day, I can't fully articulate the shock and humiliation I felt. It's one thing to be dumped in a private setting, but to have it done where your coworkers can overhear every harsh word and see the devastation on your face is another level of hurt. I can still feel the hot flush of embarrassment when I remember it. In the immediate aftermath, I tried to keep my composure. I told myself not to make a scene in response, but inside my mind was spinning. What had happened? Was it really just that minor disagreement that had pushed her away? Or was it something else I didn't see? I had no answers, and I was too upset to think rationally about it. I stayed in my job for a little while longer, hoping that I might be able to endure the awkwardness of seeing her every day. But it was just too much. The heartbreak was raw. And every time I saw her, sometimes talking to colleagues, sometimes laughing in the break room, I felt an ache that made it hard to focus on my work. My performance started slipping, and I was becoming more and more miserable each passing day. Finally, I decided that for my own peace of mind, it was best to cut ties with that environment altogether. So I quit. It wasn't an easy decision. I needed the income and I actually liked the job itself. But I realized I couldn't put myself through the pain of watching her move on right before my eyes. I found a new job elsewhere, though the pay was a bit lower. I tried to settle into a new routine, telling myself I'd made the right choice. But the city was still the same, and we lived close to each other. Running into Sarah became an uncomfortable fact of life. Random sightings at grocery stores, quick glances in coffee shops, or occasionally crossing paths at some mutual friend's gathering. Each time it happened, my chest felt tight. I realized with painful clarity that I still had feelings for her, even though I was furious and deeply hurt by what she had done. Over the next few months, we ended up exchanging a few words here and there. We were civil, but the tension was obvious. Every time we spoke, I felt a swirl of memories and bitterness. Yet beneath the anger, there was something else. I still cared about her, and if I'm honest, I was hoping she'd give me some explanation that would somehow make sense of that public breakup. Eventually, she told me she was sorry. It was one of those conversations where I initially put up a wall, not wanting to hear any excuses, but then found myself listening because I desperately needed to understand her reasons. She confessed that she'd acted rashly and regretted breaking up with me over something so trivial. She also admitted that ending things in front of everyone at work was cruel, and that she had spent months regretting it. I asked her why she'd done it that way. Had she wanted to hurt me? Was she trying to prove a point? She said she didn't fully understand it herself, that she'd felt a surge of anger in the moment and lacked the maturity to handle the situation privately. It might not have been a perfect explanation, but I saw sincerity in her eyes and I wanted so badly to believe she meant it. That was all I needed to hear to let my guard down. I asked if she wanted to try again, and we agreed to see where things would go if we started fresh. By early 2023, we were officially back together, making an effort to move past the hurt we'd caused one another, though I admit most of the hurt had been caused by her actions, while I struggled to forgive and trust again. In time, I convinced myself that the worst was behind us. The truth is, our second round as a couple felt stronger in many ways. We'd both learned from the initial breakup. She learned what it felt like to lose me, and I learned that I needed to express my feelings more openly rather than letting resentment fester. We started discussing a future more seriously. Marriage came up in casual conversation, and neither of us balked at the idea. It felt like we were heading in the right direction. I remember thinking, maybe people deserve second chances when they truly own up to what they did wrong. As the months progressed, our relationship deepened to a point where I started to picture a real life with her, a marriage, a shared home, perhaps kids someday. Though we hadn't fully delved into that subject. Motivated by these visions, I decided to take a leap of faith. I put together a plan, work extra hours to save up for an engagement ring and a down payment on a house. I wanted to build a stable future for us. I even started looking at different neighborhoods, hunting for houses that felt like they could be our home. The idea was to propose once I had a clear financial strategy, then surprise her with the fact that I had already taken steps toward buying a house. I imagined the look on her face when she realized I'd been planning this for months in secret. I imagined her joy, how she would possibly cry tears of happiness. I kept telling myself, this is how I'll show her I'm serious. Of course, working those extra hours also meant I was more tired than usual. I wasn't as available for dates or weekend trips. Without telling her my reasons, since I was determined to keep it a surprise, she must have noticed a shift in my behavior. I'd come home drained, occasionally missing our usual late-night chats, or skipping a random social outing because I needed an early night's sleep. I should have thought more carefully about how she might interpret my new routine. Out of the blue, around the time I was finalizing the details of my proposal plan, Sarah asked for a break. She didn't call it a breakup, just a break, and she wouldn't give me a clear reason. My world wobbled on its axis. We'd been talking about marriage just weeks before, so where was this coming from? I pressed her for an explanation, but she clammed up. Every time I tried to corner her gently, she'd dodge the question or say she wasn't ready to talk about it. I started replaying our recent interactions in my mind, trying to pinpoint a moment or argument that could have led to this. Nothing stood out, but I did notice something peculiar. Before, she'd been talking about this new coworker, an interesting guy in her department who liked the same music she did, who shared her sense of humor. I'd been a little jealous but brushed it off as normal workplace chatter. Then, abruptly, she stopped mentioning him at all. It wasn't even a gradual decrease in how often she brought him up. It was like he vanished from her stories completely. It struck me as bizarre, and I couldn't help but wonder, had something happened between them? Feeling confused, I contacted Emily, a close friend of mine, and a mutual acquaintance of Sarah's, who still worked at the same company as Sarah, although in a different department. Emily's boyfriend worked there too, so they occasionally had the inside scoop on the gossip that floated around. I asked if she knew what was going on with Sarah. Did people at the office see something that I was missing? Emily didn't immediately have the answers, but she offered to keep her ears open. A few days later, she came back to me with a mix of remorse and understanding in her eyes. According to what she'd gathered, some of Sarah's coworkers were nudging her to question our relationship. They had apparently been telling her that I was distant, that I wasn't as into her as before, that maybe I'd gotten complacent. Some of them, it seemed, were rooting for her to try dating the new guy instead. It made me feel sick to my stomach. Not only was my relationship in jeopardy, but there were actual bystanders egging it on. I told Emily the real reason behind my long working hours. I revealed I was planning to propose and even buy a house, that this was my way of proving my dedication to Sarah and to our future. Emily looked stunned, and I could see guilt flicker across her face. She apologized for not having known my intentions earlier, and for a moment I felt a wave of relief that at least somebody understood. That relief was short-lived. Sarah's idea of a break dragged on for nearly 2 weeks. Then, one day, she called me and asked to meet at a local cafe. My heart pounded because I'd been oscillating between heartbreak, confusion, and fleeting hope that maybe we could reconcile if I just explained why I'd been distant. I agreed to meet her, but told her she needed to tell me exactly what was going on before we discussed anything else. She looked uneasy when we finally sat down. She started by saying that my extra hours and my overall exhaustion made her feel neglected. She said she'd felt alone in the relationship, like I was pulling away from her, and that she'd become uncertain about our long-term compatibility. I listened, nodding occasionally, waiting for her to mention the new coworker. Eventually, she brought him up, but I surprised her by saying his name before she could. She blinked in confusion and then asked how I knew. I told her it was obvious. She used to talk about him all the time, then abruptly stopped. She seemed startled, insisting she'd never cheated on me or done anything physical with him. I responded that even if she didn't cheat in the literal sense, looking for someone better the moment she sensed trouble could be considered a form of emotional betrayal. I saw her eyes flicker with regret or maybe guilt. Still, I had no desire to hear more. Something inside me had snapped. I told her that whether or not she wanted to get back together, it didn't matter. I was done with us. The heartbreak in her eyes mirrored the one I felt in my chest, but I'd reached my breaking point. I'd been planning a future for us while she'd been listening to her coworkers suggesting she move on. The betrayal, the secrecy, the sudden call for a break, it all felt like an enormous blow to the trust I'd tried so hard to rebuild after the first breakup. Shortly after, I left. I couldn't stand being in the same city, haunted by the memories of my 2 failed attempts to make things work with her. I asked my employer for a transfer, and they offered me a position in a different city a couple of hours away. It was a fresh start. I used the money I'd saved for the ring and the house's down payment to cover moving costs, to set up a new apartment, and to ease the transition. It felt tragic at first, like I was abandoning all the hopes I'd painstakingly built. But it also felt like self-preservation. I needed distance, both physical and emotional, to heal. Throughout this painful move, I stayed in touch with Emily. She confessed that in a moment of weakness, she'd slipped up and told Sarah about my plans to propose and buy a house. Sarah, she said, had broken down in tears upon hearing. Emily looked guilty and apologized repeatedly. She admitted she had been trying to make Sarah understand the depth of my dedication, hoping it would smooth things over, but it backfired. I told her I appreciated her honesty. None of that changed the fact that Sarah's initial solution to the perceived distance was to contemplate a different guy or to end things again. The damage was done. I didn't see any path forward with Sarah that didn't involve reliving that pain. As time went on, I found a rhythm in my new city. The loneliness was intense some nights. I'd walk through quiet streets after work, wrestling with regret, longing, and anger in equal measure. Sometimes I'd picture Sarah's smile in my mind. There was always something about her smile that made me feel like the luckiest guy in the world. And then I'd recall the coldness in her voice when she'd asked for that break, and my chest would tighten. It was like I was at war with my own memories, the tenderness of our best moments versus the gut-wrenching betrayals. Months passed. I avoided most social media to keep from seeing any reminders of Sarah's life. It was only around mid-December that I found myself returning to my hometown for Christmas and New Year's with my family. My parents missed me, and I missed them, so I took some time off and went back. My old friends wanted to throw a reunion party since many of us had moved away for various reasons. I heard Sarah was on the guest list. Part of me wanted to skip the party altogether, but I was tired of letting my anxiety call the shots. Besides, I figured we'd probably just ignore each other. Maybe it would be okay. And for the most part, that's exactly what happened. When I arrived, the place was buzzing with old classmates, neighbors, ex-co-workers. It was surreal but also comforting to see familiar faces. Sarah and I ended up in the same large living room at one point, and she gave me a quick hello in passing. I nodded, said hi, and then we both moved on. Seeing her again, though, sparked a resurgence of complicated feelings. I watched her from a distance at one point. She was standing with a group of women, laughing and smiling, that same radiant smile that had once brightened my day. I felt this pang of something between longing and regret. It was a stark reminder of how deeply embedded she was in my emotions, even after all the turmoil. I caught myself thinking, how messed up am I that I still feel something for her after everything? Later in the evening, a friend quietly mentioned to me that Sarah's fling or relationship, whatever it was, with that new coworker had ended after only a couple of months. I found myself grappling with a swirl of conflicting emotions. A bit of satisfaction that their match didn't work out, a pang of guilt for feeling that satisfaction, and an underlying sadness for the entire situation. If I was being brutally honest, I wish that she and I had communicated better, that none of this had happened, but that was a moot point now. January rolled around and I planned to head back to my new city once my vacation ended on the 6th. I I wanted a weekend to settle in before resuming work. Right before I was set to drive out, a friend from my hometown called. He said he had a favor to ask on behalf of someone else. My stomach lurched because I had a hunch who it was. Sure enough, he said it was Sarah. Apparently, she'd been offered a position at her uncle's company, located in the same city where I now lived. She needed a ride there with her belongings, and had asked our mutual friend if he could convince me to do it. The idea of being trapped in a car with her for hours made my insides knot with anxiety. I refused immediately. I didn't bother to ask any details, I just said no. He told me I should consider talking to her, that we probably needed closure or something. But I didn't see any logic in forcing myself into such a painful situation. I made the drive alone, arriving back in my place with a sense of relief that I hadn't given in. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. The city I moved to wasn't huge, and I soon discovered that Sarah really had moved there too. One evening, as I was jogging through a local park, I paused near a bench to catch my breath. The air was crisp, and I remember focusing on the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then I heard a familiar voice say, "Hi." My heart sank. I turned to see Sarah, looking a bit nervous and uncertain. She approached carefully, as if she expected me to run away. She started with small talk, acknowledging that the party hadn't been a good environment for a serious conversation. I quickly told her I wasn't interested in talking. The sight of her brought back that old ache, and I knew it would only reopen wounds that still throbbed whenever I thought about them. She tried to insist that we needed to talk, that this unresolved tension was too much. I told her that thinking about her still hurt me a great deal, and I didn't have the emotional reserves to pick at those scabs again. She persisted for a moment, saying that was exactly why we needed closure. But I just shook my head and walked off. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but she tried to approach me twice more over the next week or so. Each time I shut her down. My friends were split in their opinions. Some said I was being too cold, that I should have a final conversation for both our sakes. Others understood my reluctance, saying I shouldn't feel pressured to expose myself to more pain. A few went so far as to call it torture, implying I was punishing. That struck me as unfair. I truly wasn't punishing, I just couldn't handle the hurt that flared whenever she was near. It wasn't anger driving me, it was self-protection. The weeks that followed were tense. Sarah kept trying to reach out through mutual friends, and she started showing up in more places where I was, to the point that even some of those friends who initially sided with her began getting frustrated. Emily, who had been a central figure in all this, posted a vague social media rant about stalker-ish behavior. Though she didn't name Sarah, people caught on quickly. It seemed Sarah was crossing lines in her pursuit of this conversation. I felt a mix of discomfort and pity. I never wanted to label her as some kind of stalker, but I also wanted her to leave me alone. One Saturday night, I went out with coworkers to watch a UFC event at a sports bar. The fights wrapped up late, and as I was heading back to my car, my phone buzzed with a call from a mutual friend. This friend said she'd just finished talking to Sarah, who asked her to relay a message to me. I hesitated, then told her to make it quick. The message was short. Sarah understood why I didn't want to talk. She promised not to reach out again, but she wanted me to know she still thought we needed to have a conversation someday. The door, she said, would remain open if I ever changed my mind. I just thanked my friend for passing it along and asked her not to bring up Sarah any. It was a relief to hear that Sarah might stop trying to contact me, though a small part of me doubted she'd stick to her promise. Finally, life seemed to settle into a new normal. Nobody brought up Sarah anymore, and I started focusing more on myself. I realized I needed time to heal. I was in no rush to jump into another relationship. The whole ordeal made me question my judgment, how quickly I jumped into things with Sarah, how casually I'd used the term friend for people who clearly had their own agendas or who didn't have my best interests at heart. I decided to take a step back from a few friendships that felt toxic or one-sided. I also entertained the idea of therapy, telling myself that if the emotional weight didn't lighten soon, I'd get professional help. Even if I never spoke to Sarah again, I needed to unburden my mind from the lingering doubt and pain. A few more weeks passed without incident. Then, out of the blue, I received a direct message from Sarah's mother. I'd always liked her parents. They had a kindness about them that I found rare and genuine. During the time Sarah and I were together, her parents were consistently supportive, never interfering too much, always respectful of boundaries. Even after both breakups, they never harassed me or took sides. So when her mother reached out, I felt a pang of reluctance and guilt. I didn't want to open this can of worms again, but I also didn't want to ignore someone who'd treated me with such goodwill. In her message, Sarah's mother said she wanted to apologize on behalf of her daughter and asked if I could spare a few minutes to call. She left me her number, which I already had saved from years before. After some internal debate, I decided to do it. If she tried to push me to reconcile with Sarah, I'd politely end the conversation. But maybe it was something simpler. When she answered, she put the call on speaker so Sarah's father could join. I held my breath, half expecting to hear Sarah's voice chime in at any moment. It never did. They both apologized for the stress and discomfort their daughter had caused with her recent behavior. I tried to interject, saying it wasn't their fault. They weren't responsible for Sarah's decisions, but they insisted. Her father admitted he'd had a frank conversation with Sarah, the kind he felt he should have had with a teenager, not an adult nearly 30 years old. She'd confessed to him just how desperate she felt to fix things, how she'd let her emotions spiral without considering how it was affecting or even how it might make her look. They reassured me that Sarah had promised to respect my boundaries and to seek therapy for herself, to figure out why she'd made those choices and handled conflict the way she did. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders as we talked. Their apology wasn't necessary, I never blamed them, but it also felt like a form of closure. It was the final seal on a chapter of my life that had been left open and oozing. Sarah, influenced by her parents' guidance, would leave me alone. She would work on herself. I even found myself hoping she would heal, that she'd become a better partner for someone else someday, or simply find her own happiness. The bitterness I'd carried for so long didn't vanish overnight, but it receded just enough to let me breathe. I thanked her parents, told them I still thought of them fondly, and hung up feeling lighter than I had in months. In the end, I realized a few lessons about love, communication, and timing. Perhaps if I'd communicated my proposal plans to Sarah, she wouldn't have jumped to the conclusion that I was becoming distant. Perhaps if she'd trusted me enough to ask me directly why I was working so hard, we could have avoided the second breakup. But life rarely gives you perfect conditions to make these big decisions or have these crucial conversations. People act rashly, they get spooked, they listen to external voices that might not have their best interest at heart. Despite all the might-haves and could-haves, I'm content to leave things where they are now. I'm focusing on myself, forging new friendships that feel genuine, and putting my energy toward building a stable, happy life in this new city. The chapter involving Sarah is over. There's no third chance or lingering desire to resurrect a relationship that, for all its highs, caused me profound hurt. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just ready to move on. It might take more time before I fully trust anyone again or feel the urge to kneel down on one knee with a ring in hand. But I'm okay with that. Healing isn't a race. If I need solitude for a while, if I need to rebuild my understanding of what love looks like, how I communicate, and who I surround myself with, then so be it. Life will move on and so will I. And if I ever decide to open that door to Sarah for a final conversation, it'll be on my own terms, without pressure from her or anyone else. But the truth is, I don't think I need it. I already have my closure, and it's enough.